All right, let's go. Number 12, the two coffins in the treasury. In a side chamber of Tutankhamun's tomb in the room, Howard Carter's team, called the treasury, there was a plain wooden box. It was undecorated. Nothing about it matched the gilded shrines and inlaid chests stacked around it. Inside were two miniature coffins, one 49.5 centimeters long, the other 57.7. Each of those held a second coffin nested inside it, gold-foiled and shaped in the form of a human body. Inside each of those lay a mummified fetus. The anatomist Douglas Derry examined them in November 1932. The smaller measured 25.75 centimeters. It still carried a 21-millimeter stump of umbilical cord and a covering of fine pale hair. The larger measured 36.1 centimeters, had eyebrows and eyelashes, and showed an 18-millimeter embalming incision running parallel to the groin, closed and packed. Linen had been inserted through the right nostril. For most of the 20th century, the story attached to the larger child was medical. X-rays taken in the 1970s by a Liverpool team were read as showing Sprengel's deformity, spina bifida, and scoliosis, and that diagnosis traveled through the literature for 30 years. Then, the bodies were put through a CT scanner in 2008, and the results were published by Zahi Hawass and Sahar Salim in 2011. The difference between the shoulder blades measured 6 millimeters and was consistent with the bones having separated and rotated after death. The apparent gap in the spine was a post-mortem fracture with fragments missing. The scoliosis was posture. There was no disease. What the scans did show was procedure. Both fetuses had received the full, high-status embalming used on adults. Evisceration where the body was large enough. Packing resin. Careful wrapping. The smaller was around 24.7 gestational weeks. The larger was around 37, close to term. They were separated by roughly 12 weeks of development, which is why the twin hypothesis has never quite settled. DNA work published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010 produced partial profiles and supported Tutankhamun as the father. A woman from tomb KV-21 is suggested by the data as the mother, though the authors state plainly that there is not enough of it to identify her by name. The identification stops there. The larger coffin held no mask of its own. A gilded child's mask recovered from an embalming cache in the Valley of the Kings cleared 15 years before Carter opened the tomb has been argued to be the one made for it and rejected as the wrong size. That too is an argument rather than a fact. After 1932, the bodies went to the Faculty of Medicine at Cairo University while the coffins stayed in the museum. And for 8 decades, the children and the boxes built for them were held in different buildings. The inscriptions stop where the DNA does. They carry only the standard funerary formula, the phrase that turns a dead person into Osiris. No personal name was written on either coffin. 2 children received the burial technology of a king, a nested set of gilded coffins, and a mask several sizes too large for the face beneath it. Nobody wrote down who they were. Number 11. The grave beneath the school. In 1975, groundwork began for a new school at Vedbeck on the north side of a filled-in fjord, about 20 kilometers above Copenhagen. The machines cut into a low rise called Bogabakken and exposed human bone. Excavation followed under Sven Erik Albrechtsen of the National Museum of Denmark and Erik Brinch Petersen of the University of Copenhagen. They recorded 17 grave features, holding 22 people, laid down around 5000 BC by coastal hunter-fisher communities of the early Ertebol. Grave 8 held a young woman of about 18 and a newborn placed beside her. She wore a great deal, close to 200 perforated animal teeth, red deer, wild boar elk, and around 200 perforated river snail shells set in rows. Across her clothing and beneath her head, a small flint blade lay at the infant's hip, and under the infant were the wing bones of a whooper swan. Red ochre was scattered through many of the Vedbeck graves, but it was not distributed evenly. It appears more heavily with infants and children than with adults, and it concentrates around the head and the pelvis. 2 of the 17 features pair an adult woman with an infant. Whether either woman died in childbirth is not something the bones can confirm. The rest of the cemetery is not gentle. Grave 19 held 3 people, An adult man, an adult woman, and a child laid between them, and a bone point was lodged in the man's throat. Two of the deepest graves at the site, holding a man of about 50 and a woman of 40 to 50, had red deer antlers laid beneath the body, one set under the shoulders and one under the pelvis. 5 of the 22 people buried on that rise were children. The swan is where the story usually becomes a painting. The child is described as cradled in a wing, laid on feathers, given flight. In 2013, Nick Overton and Yanis Hamalakis went back to the original excavation plan and the field photographs and found something narrower. The child was not resting on a whole wing. What is present is the tip, the hand of the wing, the carpometacarpus, and the bones beyond it running from the child's feet up toward the pelvis. Had the whole wing been laid in the grave, the forearm and upper arm would have extended away from the body rather than under it. Nobody has been able to re-examine the material directly because the grave was lifted as a block of soil and the bones are still inside it. So the gesture was smaller and stranger than the popular version, not a bed of feathers. The end of one wing positioned along the length of a body that was less than a day old at death. Whooper swans winter on Danish water and leave in spring. Whether that had anything to do with the choice cannot be recovered. The teeth she wore can be counted, and the shells can be counted, and the wing bones are still in the block of earth lifted out of Bogabakan in 1975. The reason for the swan went into the ground with the people who put it there. Number 10. The platform below the summit. Volcan Lula stands on the Argentina-Chile border at 6,739 meters, just under the summit. At roughly 6 to 715 meters, the Inca built a rectangular ceremonial platform about 11 meters by 6. It is the highest archaeological site on Earth, reached by a route with a base camp at 5,200 meters and staging posts at 5,600, 6,300, and 6,550. In March 1999, an expedition co-directed by Johann Reinhard and Maria Constanza Cerruti opened. 3 shafts cut about 1.7 meters into the platform fill. Each held a child frozen. Around them lay some 145 objects, miniature figurines in gold, silver, and spondylus shell, textile sandals, bags pottery feathers, coca leaves. The oldest was a girl of about 13, known as the Maiden. She was seated cross-legged with her hands in her lap, and her head bowed toward her knees, her hair in fine braids beneath a feathered headdress. A green quid of chewed coca was still in her mouth. The other 2 were 4 or 5 years old. The boy was the only one bound. A textile had been wrapped around him tightly enough to displace ribs and pelvis. The girl, now called the Lightning Girl, was struck by lightning at some point after burial, which damaged her face, one shoulder, and an ear. Hair grows at roughly a centimeter a month, and it locks the chemistry of the body into a sequence. That is the reason these 3 bodies carry a timeline. In 2007, a team led by Andrew Wilson published segmented isotope work showing that all 3 shifted from a peasant diet of tubers to elite food maize and animal protein beginning about 12 months before death. In 2013, the same group ran liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry across the same segments, measuring coca metabolites and ethyl glucuronide, the marker left by alcohol. The pattern is a schedule. Coca consumption rises sharply about a year before death and peaks around 6 months out. Alcohol concentrates in the final weeks. The maiden's hair preserved about 21 months of record, and her coca values are the highest yet measured in Andean remains. The younger 2 show roughly 9 months at lower levels with a different profile. The ritual treated them differently. What the chemistry establishes is consumption and its timing. What it does not establish is intent, and the researchers say so. There is no trauma on any of the 3. The cause of death is not demonstrated. A study published in 2026 tightened the date. Radiocarbon run on short-lived grave goods. Maize manioc coca leaves and modeled to work around the difficulties of Southern Hemisphere calibration. Narrowed the event from a broad window to somewhere between AD 1462 and 1507. Most probably around 1499. That places it inside the empire's southern campaigns. The study also reports finding nothing in the volcanic or climate record. to support the idea that the platform was a response to a disaster. The three children are held at the Museo de Arqueología de Alta Montana in Salta, in climate-controlled capsules built to cryopreservation standards. One is shown at a time on rotation. Indigenous organizations in Argentina have objected to the display since it opened. The bodies are intact enough that the objection is not abstract. Number 9. The pond that kept the dead. In 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt was clearing muck from a small peat pond in Brevard County, Florida, to build a road through a housing development. He hit skulls. He stopped, and the developer stopped the work, and the first assumption was a crime scene. Radiocarbon came back at 7,000 to 8,000 years. Excavation ran through 3 seasons, from 1984 under Glenn Doran and David Dickel of Florida State University. Around 160 wells were sunk to draw the water table down, and the peat was taken out by hand. The site produced 168 individuals, buried over roughly 1,000 years in a handful of episodes. The dead were laid flexed most on the left side heads, generally to the west, wrapped in cloth, and then pinned down into the pond mud with sharpened wooden stakes, driven through the wrappings. That detail is the whole reason Wendover exists as a site. The bodies went into water-saturated peat at neutral pH with almost no oxygen and stayed there. 91 skulls still contained brain tissue shrunken to about a quarter of its volume, but holding its gross shape, which means those bodies were in the pond within a day or two of death. 86 fragments of textile came out of 37 burials in 7 distinct weaves, mostly worked from palmetto fiber. Twining plain weave, cordage bags, matting hoods. About half of the people in the pond died before they were 20. One of them was an adolescent of roughly 15. Dickel and Doran published his skeleton in 1989. He had spina bifida aperta, an open failure of the neural arches running from the third lumbar vertebra to the second sacral. His lumbar spine was scoliotic from malformed joints. His right tibia and fibula carried severe infection. His long bones showed the thinning of disuse. One foot was gone, and the lower leg had healed over as a stump. He lived to 15 in a wetland, and the authors read that as evidence of long-term care. The reading has been contested since. In 1991, Catherine Detweiler took that passage apart directly, arguing that survival is not proof of compassion, that impairment is not the same as dependence, and that the emotional life behind a skeleton is not recoverable from the skeleton. She is not wrong about the limits. What is beyond dispute is that a boy who could not walk normally and who was carrying a bone infection reached adolescence in a community that had no wheels, no medicine, and no surplus, and was then wrapped and staked into the pond alongside everyone else. Wendover produced one more result that has aged instructively. In 1986, the team published the recovery of human DNA from the preserved brain tissue in the journal Nature, at the time the oldest human DNA anyone had extracted. Mitochondrial sequences followed in the 1990s and were used to argue for population continuity at the site. Those sequences are no longer accepted. They resemble European mitochondrial types rather than anything native, American or Asian, and they are now attributed to modern contamination. The brains are still there. What was read out of them was mostly the people doing the reading. Wendover has one more feature worth knowing. Roughly half of the pond was never excavated. Doran's team left it deliberately on the reasoning that future methods would read it better than theirs could. It is still there underwater in a Florida subdivision. Number 8. The 10,000 beads. In 1955, a clay pit outside the city of Vladimir, about 190 kilometers east of Moscow, cut into an upper Paleolithic site on the bank of the Kliazma. Excavation began 2 years later under Otto Bader and ran for 16 seasons. In 1969, his team opened the feature known as Grave 2. It was a long, shallow pit cut into loess holding 2 children laid head-to-head, both extended on their backs, both heavily covered in red ochre. One was about 12 years old, the other about 10. The age of the grave took decades to settle. 20th century radiocarbon put the burials around 24 to 26,000 years old, and those figures fill the older literature. They were too young. The bones had been treated with conservation chemicals in a museum, and that modern carbon was being measured along with the bone. Later work isolated hydroxyproline, an amino acid found in bone collagen and effectively nowhere else, and dated that, instead moving the burials back to roughly 34,000 years ago. The method has its critics, but that is the figure in current use. They were dressed in beads, roughly 5,000, with one child, roughly 5,000. 400 with the other mammoth ivory, each one perforated and sewn onto clothing. The way the beads fell allows the garments to be reconstructed, fitted shirts, trousers joined to footwear caps. Around them lay 16 ivory points ranging from 27 centimeters to nearly 2.5 meters, made from mammoth tusk straight along their whole length. A band of pierced Arctic fox canines lay at the waist of the older boy. There were ivory armbands, pierced antler battens, openwork ivory discs, and a small carved mammoth. A human thigh bone with both ends removed, and the marrow cavity packed solid with ochre, had been laid beside one of them. A human fibula lay across each child's chest. Experimental replication puts the manufacture of a single ivory bead somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour. Estimates vary widely, and the excavator's own synthesis declines to give a figure. Even at the low end, the beadwork in that one grave represents thousands of hours of labor, spent on two children who had not reached adolescence. The obvious conclusion was inherited rank, a lineage rich enough to bury its young like that. Then the genomes came back. In 2017, a team led by Martin Sikora sequenced 4 individuals from the site, including both children and the ochre-packed femur laid beside them. All of them were male, which retired the long-standing description of the younger child as a girl. And none of them were related at the 3rd degree or closer. The 2 children, in grave 2, sharing a pit and an orientation and a wardrobe, were not brothers. They were not first cousins. The population's effective size came out around 200, with a mating pattern that looks like small bands, deliberately exchanging partners across a wider network rather than pairing within themselves. Both children were also physically unusual. The younger one's femora are short and symmetrically bowed, forward a congenital condition confined entirely to the thigh bones described by Vincenzo Formicola and Alexandra Buzilova in 2004. The rest of the skeleton is normal, and later work argues he stayed mobile. The older child has almost no wear on his teeth, unusually light muscle attachments, and a degree of jaw projection not otherwise recorded in Pleistocene Europe. Both carry multiple enamel defects from developmental stress. The richest Ice Age grave in Europe holds 2 boys who were not family, whose bodies were both anomalous, and whose community spent an extraordinary quantity of labor dressing them for the ground. Whether the anomalies are the reason for the grave is a question the excavators raise and leave open. The beads can be counted. The reason cannot. Number 7. The mummies that began with the smallest bodies. Mummification is normally told as a story about power. Kings, priests, the wealthy dead of Egypt, preserved because they could afford to be. On the desert coast between southern Peru and northern Chile, the practice is older, and it did not work that way. The Chinchorro were maritime. Hunters and fishers of the Atacama and their mortuary sequence runs from roughly 7000 BC. The Atacama is dry enough that bodies laid in the ground desiccate on their own. Around a third of known Chinchorro mummies are natural, and natural preservation predates the deliberate practice by about 2,000 years. People there already lived among visible, intact dead. Then, around 5050 BC in the Camerones Valley, someone took a body apart and rebuilt it. The oldest artificially prepared human body known anywhere belongs to a child. The technique is not embalming. Nothing preservative is applied. The body is disassembled, head, arms, legs separated from the trunk. The skin is removed and set aside. The flesh is cut away with stone tools. The brain taken out through the base. Of the skull, the organs removed. The bones are dried with hot ash and coals. Then, an internal armature of wooden sticks and reeds is lashed in place, with cord to hold the body rigid. The cavities are packed with plant fiber, grass, ash, soil, animals' hair, and clay, and the whole form is modeled over with a white ash paste. The original skin is fitted back on, patched where it has failed with sea lion hide, or skin taken from another person. A clay mask goes over the face with slits left at the eyes and mouth. A short wig of human hair is tied on. The surface is painted, black with manganese, identified mineralogically as manganite and cryptomelane. This was not reserved. Men, women, elders, children, infants, and fetuses all received it across 2,000 years, with no visible restriction by status, and the youngest are not incidental to the practice. The earliest prepared bodies are dominated by newborns and infants. One of the 5 recognized styles. The bandage technique is known from 3 individuals, and all 3 are infants. At the Moro 1 cemetery, 42 of 96 bodies are children. The environmental explanation came from Bernardo Ariazza. Water in the Camarones Valley carries arsenic at roughly 1,000 to 1,300 micrograms per liter. The World Health Organization guideline is 10. Arsenic crosses the placenta, and in a documented 20th century exposure episode in northern Chile at lower concentrations, infant mortality rose sharply. Working with the chemist Dulasiri Amarasiri Vardena Ariaza, analyzed hair from 46 Chinchorro mummies across 10 sites and found chronic arsenic exposure at every one of them. The exposure is demonstrated. The causal step is not. Ariaza proposes that constant pregnancy, loss, and infant death drove a community to keep its dead children present rather than let them go, and that the practice spread outward from there to everyone. A competing model published in 2012 with Ariaza himself among the authors argues instead from freshwater discharge marine productivity and population growth, and states plainly that the relative contributions cannot be separated. What is not in question is the object. Roughly 300 of these bodies survive, most of them in storage in Arica. They are not preserved people. They are people taken apart and rebuilt, wearing their own skin over a frame of sticks with a clay face, and a slit where the mouth was, and the smallest of them were made first. Number 6. The pit beneath the hearth. In the Tanana lowlands of central Alaska, there is a sand dune capped with wind-blown silt, sitting on a terrace above the river floodplain. Its coordinates are not published. Ben Potter's team excavated there across several seasons, and in 2010 they found the cremated remains of a 3-year-old in the central cooking hearth of a house floor. In 2013, they dug beneath that hearth and found a pit about 50 centimeters across, cut 40 centimeters below the hearth floor and 90 centimeters below the living surface. The bottom of the pit was covered with a patch of red ochre about 30 centimeters wide. 2 infants lay in it, both coated in ochre from head to foot. With them were 4 beveled foreshafts of wapiti antler. 3 are large, between 44.6 and 52.5 centimeters incised with repeating X patterns. The 4th is 27.9 centimeters in plane. 2 bifacial basalt points, 8.3 and 9.2 centimeters, were still hafted to 2 of the foreshafts. It is among the oldest composite hunting equipment known from North America, and it was put in the grounds with 2 babies. One had lived about 6 weeks. The other was a late-term fetus of around 33 weeks. The sequence matters and is usually reported wrongly. The infants went in first. The pit was filled back up. To the hearth was rebuilt and cooking resumed on top of them. Only later was the 3-year-old cremated in that same hearth, the hearth filled in, and the house abandoned. Radiocarbon puts all of it at about 11,500 years ago, and cannot separate the 2 events. The 2 treatments do not resemble each other. The infants were laid in an ochre-lined pit with the most valuable equipment a hunting community owned. The 3-year-old was burned in the open hearth of the house in poplar fuel, at temperatures that ran from around 300 degrees to over 800. For something between 1 and 3 hours, the bone color records that running from black through gray to fully calcined white. Less than a fifth of the skeleton survived. Nothing was placed with the body. Then, the house was closed and the family left. Whether that difference reflects age, circumstance, season, or something with no modern equivalent is not recoverable. The same people did both things in the same square meter of floor. Within a span, the dating cannot resolve. Mitochondrial genomes published in 2015 gave the first turn. The two infants belonged to different maternal lineages, one C1b, one B2. They did not share a mother. The second turn came in 2018. A nuclear genome recovered from the 6-week-old infant at 17-fold coverage placed her outside every other ancient and living Native American lineage yet sequenced. Not an ancestor of one branch or another, but a sister population to all of them, splitting from the founding group somewhere around 20,000 years ago and remaining in the north. The team named them the Ancient Barinians. They have no known living descendants. Almost everything understood about them comes from one infant who lived 6 weeks. The work was done under an agreement signed before excavation began between the Healy Lake Tribal Council, the Tanana Chiefs Conference, the National Science Foundation, and the state of Alaska. The council gave the 3 children names in the Salchaket dialect: Zachete, Anyen, Teide, Guy, Sunrise Girl Child, Yelkanan Taid, Guy Dawn, Twilight Girl Child, and Zasa Chij, Siniin, Upward Sun, River Mouth Child. Their final disposition has still not been decided. A whole branch of the human family is reconstructed from a child who never learned to hold her head up, and the names she is known by were given 11,500 years after she died. Number 5. The antlers on the chest. At Kafsa Cave in the Lower Galilee, about 3 kilometers south of Nazareth. The burials were not found inside the cave, but on the terrace in front of it. In 1969, working near the southern wall, Bernard Vandermeersch's team exposed a pit cut directly into bedrock, roughly rectangular, 50 to 60 centimeters wide, 25 to 30 deep, oriented north to south. An adolescent lay in it, supine head turned to the right, upper limbs flexed with the hands brought together near the face. Across the upper chest, just below the head, were the antlers of the large deer with a section of the animal's skull still attached. The broken forehead of the deer was in direct contact with the bones of the child's right hand. The layers at Kafsa have been dated by thermoluminescence and electron spin resonance to somewhere between 90 and 100,000 years ago. That is far beyond the reach of radiocarbon, and it makes this one of the earliest deliberate human burials documented anywhere. The surrounding deposits are unusual in their own right. 71 pieces of ochre came out of the burial-bearing layers, along with ochre-stained tools. And geochemical work indicates the material was selected for its color rather than picked up incidentally. Perforated marine shells were carried in from the Mediterranean, about 35 kilometers away, with wear marks consistent with having been strung. The individual in the pit was about 12 or 13, aged from dental development. The sex has never been determined, and the excavation reports say so. Kafsa is not a single grave. At least 25 people are represented in the Mousterian deposits, and roughly half of them are children. 2 years before the antler burial was found, the same excavation opened a shallow feature holding an adult and a 6-year-old. The child laid perpendicular to the adult, with one arm a few centimeters above the adult's right foot, the two bodies pressed into a space barely large enough for them. Vandermeersch and Ofer Bar Yosef describe it as the only double inhumation known from the Middle Paleolithic record. The detail that changes the story arrived in 2014 when Helene Cocuño and colleagues scanned the skull and built a virtual reconstruction, including a cast of the brain cavity. There is a depressed fracture in the right frontal bone above the temple. The driven-in fragment measures roughly 30 by 23 millimeters, with fracture lines radiating away from it. The pattern is consistent with the blow. The bone had remodeled. The child survived it, but the brain cavity holds only 81 to 86% of adult volume, while the teeth show development appropriate to the age growth had fallen behind. And the lesion sits over regions associated with movement attention and the management of tasks. The authors conclude that the injury left lasting neurological effects and that the child lived with them. So the sequence is a child struck hard enough to drive a piece of skull inward, surviving long enough for the bone to heal and for development to slow, dying at 12 or 13, and then being placed in a pit, hacked, into bedrock with a deer's antlers laid across the chest and against the hands. Every part of that can be measured except the part that matters. Who struck the blow or what did is unknown. Whether the antlers were an offering, a marker, a debt, or a possession cannot be demonstrated from bone and stone. The pit is 50 centimeters wide. The fracture is 30 millimeters across. The reason the deer was in the grave is not preserved in anything. Number 4. The child in the sterile layer. Between 1970 and 1973, Henri Delporte's excavation at the Great Rock Shelter of La Farasse in the Dordogne recovered the remains of a small Neanderthal child from a deposit labeled Layer M2. The bones were catalogued as La Farasse 8. For the next 40 years, they were a footnote, an incomplete 2-year-old from a site already famous for older, better skeletons. That fame is worth pausing on because of what it consists of. 7 partial or complete Neanderthal skeletons have come out of La Farasse, and only 2 are adults, a man of about 45 and a woman in her late 20s, found in 1909 and 1910, lying roughly head-to-head about 50 centimeters apart. The other 5 are children, a 10-year-old, a newborn, and a full-term fetus sharing one pit, a 7-month fetus, a child of 3 to 5 whose skull lay more than a meter from the rest of the body beneath a limestone slab with cup-shaped hollows carved into its underside, and the 2-year-old in Layer M2. Then, a team led by Antoine Balzeau, with Asier Gomez Olivencia, went back to the material rather than to the ground, working through unsorted paleontological boxes at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. They identified 47 additional human bones belonging to the child, most of them from the 1970 season, which had been sitting unrecognized among animal remains. They also refitted more than 25 fragments of a single bison horn core from the same deposit. The case they published in 2020 is built from 5 independent lines, and none of them is dramatic on its own. A Neanderthal bone from the deposit was identified by collagen fingerprinting, confirmed by mitochondrial DNA and directly radiocarbon dated to between 41,700 and 4,800 years ago. That date is younger than the material in the layers above it, which is the opposite of what undisturbed stratigraphy produces, and consistent with the body having been introduced downward into older sediment. The child's bones are very well preserved, barely weathered, with no carnivore tooth marks, no cut marks, no green bone fractures, and no burning. The animal bone from the same deposit is the reverse in every particular fragmented, gnawed, cut, and burnt. Whatever happened to the child did not happen to anything else in that sediment. The remains were covered quickly. Parts of the skeleton were still in anatomical connection, and some fragments refit directly to each other. The body was not scattered. The remains lie along a west to east axis across 94 centimeters, with the head to the east and sitting higher than the pelvis on an incline that does not follow the geological dip of the layer, and Layer M2 is otherwise sterile. Nothing else is in it anywhere except in the small area where the child was found. The authors state their conclusion carefully. Burial is the most parsimonious explanation, not proof, and no grave goods are claimed. The horn core is context, not an offering. The wider debate about Neanderthal burial has been running since Robert Gargette's challenge in 1989, and it remains unsettled precisely because the classic excavations were done before the recording standards existed to test them. The famous mounds at La Farasse, read for a century as deliberate constructions, were reinterpreted in 2023 as natural periglacial features. One problem is left standing, and the authors flag it themselves. The child's arms and legs are missing. 4 hand bones survive, and nothing else of the limbs. Whether they were lost to geology, lost in a century of excavation and curation, or never placed in the ground is unresolved. 4 hand bones are all that survive of that child's limbs. 47 of its other bones spent half a century in Paris in boxes labeled as animal remains. The layer it came out of is still there in the Dordogne, and there is still nothing else in it. Number 3. the mud that recorded the day. Around the middle of the 15th century, heavy rain fell on a stretch of desert coast in northern Peru. Water came off the dunes and spread a layer of mud and gravel across the sand a few hundred meters from the sea, north of the Chimu capital at Chanchan. The layer set hard and held what had been pressed into it: the prints of adults in sandals, the prints of barefoot children, the tracks of camelids and dogs, and long skid marks where animals had been dragged. In at least two places, the prints converge, one set coming in from the north and another from the south, meeting near the center of the site. Under that layer were 137 children, 3 adults, and 200 young llamas and alpacas. The site is called Huanchaquito Las Llamas. Local residents reported bones eroding out of the dune in 2011 to Gabriel Prieto, who was excavating a fishing settlement nearby. Fieldwork ran across 3 seasons, with skeletal analysis by John Verano, and 20 accelerator radiocarbon dates from 2 laboratories cluster between AD 1400 and 1450. The children were between 5 and 14, most of them 8 to 12. Nearly every one with a complete sternum has a single, clean transverse, cut through one of its segments. About a tenth of the children carry similar marks on the 3rd or 4th rib, and in body after body, the ribs are splayed outward from the midline. The camelids, all of them under about 18 months old and 3/4 under 9 months, show the same cuts in the same places. The author's phrasing on what that means is precise and worth keeping. Opening the chest is evident. Heart removal is a likely motivation. Soft tissue did not survive well enough to demonstrate it. The 3 adults are the exception that sharpens the rest. 2 were women, one 18 and one in her 20s, both with blunt force injuries to the skull and face. The 3rd was a man of 30 to 40 with broken ribs. None of the 3 had the chest cut open. Whatever category the children were in, the adults were not in it. Some of the children had red, cinnabar-based pigment on the face. Some, mostly the older ones, wore cotton headdresses. All were in plain cotton shrouds. Nothing was placed with the bodies. No vessels, no ornaments, no offerings of any kind in contact with the child. Most of them were laid facing northwest toward the sea. The camelids faced east toward the mountains. Then the isotopes came back, and the skulls were compared. The carbon and nitrogen values spread far wider than a single community would produce. And the styles of intentional cranial shaping are mixed elongated highland forms lying beside flattened coastal ones. Dental morphology points the same way. These children did not come from one place. They were gathered from across the territory and brought to a dune above the beach. Huanchaquito is also not isolated. A second ground at Pampa La Cruz close by has produced 80 radiocarbon dates, and they resolve into 6 separate sacrificial events between roughly AD 1050 and 1500. The proportion of children with the chest cut rises steadily through that sequence, from around a quarter in the earliest events to over 80% in the last. Whatever this was, it was not a single act of panic. It was practiced, and it changed across 4 centuries of Chimu life on that coast. Across the Huanchaco sites, the recovered total now exceeds 300 children, with a further group reported from a new sector as recently as 2024. Roughly 1/7 of the estimated sacrificial ground at Pampa La Cruz has been dug. The mud that sealed the site is the same mud that preserved the footprints, and the rain that made it may be the reason the whole thing happened. That connection is an inference, not a demonstration. What is not an inference is the surface itself. A hardened sheet of desert mud a few hundred meters from the Pacific, holding the prints of sandals that walked away and the prints of bare feet that did not. Number 2. The child under 2 stones. Grotta delle Mura opens on the coast at Monopoli in Apulia, on the heel of Italy. Its deposits run from the Mousterian through the end of the Ice Age. In 1998, a team under Mauro Calatini, working the final epigravettian layer, uncovered a skull. The rest of the skeleton came out the following season. It is the only burial the cave has produced. The body lay on its back arms at the sides oriented northwest to southeast. 2 flat stone slabs had been placed over it at right angles to one another. one across the feet, one across the torso and up to the jaw. The head was left uncovered, wedged in place between smaller stones. There was no ochre. There were no objects. Radiocarbon puts the burial at between 17,320 and 16,910 years ago, just after the last glacial maximum. For 25 years, that was the entire story. A small skeleton, 2 slabs a date. Infant burials from this period in Italy are rare, enough that each one carries weight, and this one had almost nothing attached to it. No pigment, no ornament, no tools. Nothing that could be read as ritual or as status. Then, in 2024, a study led by Owen Alexander Higgins with Alessandra Modi, Stefano Benazzi, and David Caramelli read the child from the inside. He was male, established genetically. He was about 72 weeks old, 16 and a half months, established from the growth increments inside his teeth rather than from bone size. Roughly 3/4 of his genome was recovered. His ancestry is entirely of the Villabruna-related Western hunter-gatherer type, which shows that cluster was already present at the southern end of the peninsula 17,000 years ago. The pigmentation prediction from his DNA gives dark skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair, which was the ordinary combination for European hunter-gatherers of the period. Long stretches of his genome are identical on both chromosomes, 213 centimorgans in long runs, which indicates his parents were closely related at a degree consistent with first cousins. His community was small and not exchanging partners widely. He also carried 2 heterozygous variants in TNNT2 and MIBPC3 genes that build the contractile machinery of heart muscle and that are associated with familial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The authors are careful with this. They describe a potential congenital heart condition that may account for the developmental stress they can see. It is not a diagnosis, and it is not a demonstrated cause of death. The developmental stress is the part that is not in doubt, because teeth record it directly. Enamel is laid down in daily increments, and a physiological crisis leaves a visible line. His upper front milk tooth began forming about 30 weeks before he was born. It carries 4 accentuated lines at roughly 21 weeks before birth, 11 weeks before, 5 weeks before, and 3 weeks after. His first permanent molar carries 5 more at 17, 20, 40, 45, and 52 weeks after birth. 9 episodes of physiological stress in a life of 16 months. 3 of them before he was born. Strontium in his enamel matches the local bedrock range, meaning his mother stayed close to that stretch of coast through the last months of her pregnancy, while other groups of that period moved. The researchers suggest her own health may explain both the immobility and the marks laid down in a tooth that had not yet erupted. That is a strange thing to be able to say about a person from the last ice age. Not that he lived and died, or that he was buried under stones, but that on a particular week, roughly 5 months before his birth, something went badly wrong in his mother's body, and the tooth forming in his jaw recorded it. The record survived because enamel does not remodel. Every line in it stays where it formed in order with a date attached. The same tissue is forming right now in every living child, keeping the same kind of ledger. And in almost every case, it is destroyed or worn away or never read. 2 slabs were laid over him, one on the feet and one across the body to the jaw. The face was left open. Number 1, the child called Mtoto. Panga ya Saidi is a cave in the Zitsoni limestone hills of Kilifi County, in southeastern Kenya, about 15 kilometers inland from the Indian Ocean. It sits in coastal forest, between the shore and the drier country behind it, and people have used it more or less continuously for 78,000 years. Excavation has been running there since 2010 under the Ceilings Project with the National Museums of Kenya. In 2013, roughly 3 meters below the cave floor, the trench encountered bone. It was so degraded that it disintegrated on contact, and the team could not tell what they had. They stopped digging it. In 2017, they came back and exposed the whole feature. It was a shallow pit, roughly circular, 36.7 centimeters north to south, 39.8 centimeters east to west, and 12.5 centimeters deep. Rather than excavate it, they consolidated the entire block of sediment, encased it in plaster, and lifted it out. It went first to Nairobi, then to the National Research Center on Human Evolution in Burgos, Spain, where Maria Martinon Torres and Elena Santos took it apart under a microscope over a period of months. 2 teeth appeared first. That was the point at which the excavation knew it had a person. Optically stimulated luminescence on single quartz grains dates the pit to 78,300 years ago. Give or take 4,100. The child was 2.5 to 3 years old. The sex could not be determined, and probably never will be. The species is Homo sapiens. But the teeth carry features that are not modern in the usual sense. Heavily crenulated enamel extratubercles, exaggerated cusps, large, subdivided rear cusps. The assembly of what we call a modern human was still in progress in this child's mouth. The pit was dug on purpose. That is not an impression. It is chemistry and sediment structure. The fill differs from the surrounding deposits in composition and grain size, and its micromorphology shows it was put back rapidly using the same material that came out. The body lay on its right side, tightly flexed knees drawn up toward the chest. The skeleton is strictly articulated, and the joints that come apart first when a body decomposes in open air are undisplaced, which means decomposition happened in place, in a filled space, and that the child was covered soon after death. 2 further observations do the quiet work. The collarbones are pressed downward and rotated, in a way that is consistent with the upper body having been wrapped in cloth or hide or bound tightly, and the head has collapsed and shifted in a direction that is consistent with something perishable having decayed away from beneath it. The excavators describe it as a support. In the coverage, it became a pillow. Neither the wrapping nor the support survives. Both are red from where the bones ended up. There were no grave goods, no ochre. Nothing was placed in the pit but the child. A fragment of giant African land snail shell from the site carries deliberate tool incisions, and the team recorded it and specifically declined to read anything symbolic into it because it did not come from the grave. That restraint runs through the whole publication, and it is the reason the burial claim has held. This is the oldest known human burial in Africa, and the qualifier is doing real work. Burials at Kafsa and School in the Levant are older. Border Cave in South Africa produced an infant burial of roughly comparable antiquity, usually placed around 74,000 years. But it came out of a 1941 excavation with documentation too thin to test. And Africa's record is thin for a reason that has nothing to do with behavior. A shallow grave dug in open ground does not survive 78,000 years. This one survived because a cave happened to be sitting over it. So what we have is not the first grave. It is the earliest one Africa has let us look at. And what it shows is not a monument, not a treasury, not a ritual deposit. It is a hole in the floor of a place where people were living. Dug, shallow, filled in fast with a toddler curled inside it, wrapped in something that rotted and resting on something that rotted. The researchers call the child Mtoto. It is the Swahili word for child, and it was chosen because there was nothing else to call the individual. Everything recoverable about this person is now recorded: age, posture, orientation, the chemistry of the dirt, the shape of the cusps on unerupted teeth. The one thing that has not survived is the reason, and whatever this child was called, by the people who dug the hole. The hollow they cut is less than 40 centimeters across. It is the oldest grave anyone in Africa is known to have dug, and it was dug for a 3-year-old. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.